The day my wife told me another man was an irreplaceable part of her life was not the day my marriage ended. It was the day I realized it had been slipping away for years. 3 months later, she would stand at my front door asking for something she never thought she could lose. But on that night, I had no idea where any of this was heading. My name is Ryan Brooks. I am 42 years old, and until recently, I believed loyalty was enough to hold a marriage together. I believed showing up every day mattered. I believed being dependable mattered. Most of all, I believed that when two people promised to build a life together, they were supposed to protect that life from anything that threatened it. Looking back now, I realize how naive that sounds. The evening everything changed started like any other. Lauren and I were attending a birthday dinner for one of her friends at a restaurant in downtown Denver. The place was busy but elegant, with soft lighting reflecting off wine glasses and polished wood tables. Through the windows, the city lights stretched across the cold Colorado evening. People laughed. Servers moved between tables carrying plates that smelled of grilled steak and fresh herbs. It was the kind of setting where everyone looked happy. The kind of setting where nobody notices a marriage quietly falling apart. Lauren looked beautiful that night. She always did. Across the table sat Derek Sullivan, her former boyfriend, a man who had somehow remained present throughout our entire marriage. At first, years ago, I had tried to convince myself their friendship was harmless. Lauren always insisted it was. She said they shared history, shared memories, shared experiences. Every time I expressed discomfort, she reassured me that I had nothing to worry about. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up. Not because I felt better, because I was tired of being told my feelings were the problem. As the dinner continued, stories from the past started filling the conversation. College memories, road trips, old friends. Predictably, Derek became part of almost every story. He always did. The strange thing was not that Lauren remembered those moments. The strange thing was the way her face changed whenever she talked about them. Her smile became brighter. Her voice became lighter. It was a version of her I rarely saw anymore. Then someone jokingly asked how Lauren and Derek had managed to stay so close after all these years. Several people laughed. A few leaned forward waiting for the answer. Lauren smiled and looked directly at me before speaking. You cannot stop me from seeing Derek anytime I want. He is an integral part of my life. The table went quiet for a brief moment. Not long, just long enough. Then nervous laughter followed, and the conversation moved on. But I remained frozen. I remember staring at the water glass in front of me. Tiny drops of condensation slid slowly down the side. The restaurant noise faded into the background. Lauren had said it casually, confidently, as if she were announcing a simple fact everyone already understood. What hurt was not the mention of Derek. What hurt was what her words revealed. In that moment, she was not protecting our marriage. She was protecting her connection to him, and she expected me to accept it. I did not argue. I did not make a scene. I did not raise my voice. I simply sat there listening to conversations continue around me while a realization settled heavily into my chest. For years, I had been trying to earn a level of consideration that should have come naturally from a spouse. The drive home was quiet. Lauren scrolled through her phone while city lights passed across the windshield. Neither of us mentioned what had happened. When we reached home, she went inside as though the evening had been completely normal. I stood alone in the driveway for a few moments looking up at the dark sky above our neighborhood. The air felt colder than before. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. At the time, I thought the most painful part was hearing those words. I was wrong. The most painful part was realizing they reflected something much deeper. And what I would discover over the following months would change everything I thought I knew about my marriage. The days that followed felt strangely ordinary. That was what made them so unsettling. Nothing dramatic happened. No major confrontation. No shocking discovery. Life simply continued, and somehow that made everything worse. Lauren went to work. I went to work. We shared dinners, watched television, paid bills. From the outside, we looked like any other married couple living in a quiet Colorado suburb. But something had changed inside me. Once a person sees something clearly, they cannot force themselves to become blind again. A week after that dinner, Lauren mentioned that Derek would be joining a group gathering downtown. She said it casually while making coffee one morning. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen as sunlight streamed through the windows. I simply nodded. She looked at me for a second as if waiting for a reaction. When none came, she returned her attention to her phone. That moment stayed with me. For years, every discussion involving Derek had followed the same pattern. I would express discomfort. Lauren would tell me I was overthinking things. Eventually, I would back down because I did not want another argument. This time there was no discussion, no resistance, no frustration, just silence. Looking back, I think that was the first moment she noticed something was different. Over the following weeks, Derek seemed to appear everywhere. Sometimes it was a lunch with mutual friends. Other times it was a weekend event, a community fundraiser, or a casual gathering. Every story somehow included him. Every conversation eventually circled back to him. I began noticing details I had ignored for years. Lauren always answered his messages quickly. She remembered small details about his life. She laughed at jokes she had heard multiple times before. None of those things were wrong by themselves. The problem was what they revealed when viewed together. One Saturday afternoon, I returned home after helping a friend move into a new house. The sky was bright blue, and a warm breeze carried the first hints of autumn across the neighborhood. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed another vehicle parked outside. Derek's vehicle. When I walked through the front door, I found Lauren and Derek sitting at our kitchen island drinking coffee. They were laughing about something that had happened years ago. Neither seemed surprised to see me. Lauren smiled and greeted me as if everything was completely normal. Derek nodded and asked how my day had gone. I answered politely. Then I stood there for a moment looking at the two of them sitting comfortably in my kitchen. The scene itself was not inappropriate. Yet something about it felt deeply unsettling. Not because Derek was there, because nobody seemed to think I might have feelings about it. Later that evening, after Derek left, Lauren mentioned how nice it was that everyone could remain mature and get along. I remember looking at her while she loaded dishes into the dishwasher. The kitchen lights reflected off the stainless steel appliances. Outside, darkness settled across the neighborhood. I wanted to tell her that maturity was not the issue. Respect was. But I already knew how that conversation would end. So I stayed quiet. A few days later, we attended another social gathering. Throughout the evening, I watched Lauren and Derek move effortlessly through conversations together. They shared stories, finished each other's sentences, referenced memories that existed long before I entered Lauren's life. Standing there with a drink in my hand, surrounded by laughter and music, I realized something painful. I was not competing against another man. I was competing against history, and history always has an advantage. Looking back, that realization should have made me angry. Instead, it made me tired, deeply tired, because for the first time, I began asking a question I had spent years avoiding. If my wife worked this hard to preserve her connection with Derek, why did preserving our marriage never seem to require the same level of effort? The question followed me for weeks, not because I could not answer it, but because I already knew the answer and did not want to admit it. Autumn gradually gave way to winter across Colorado. The mornings became colder. Frost appeared on rooftops before sunrise. The mountains in the distance collected fresh snow, turning bright white beneath clear blue skies. Life continued moving forward exactly as it always had, yet something inside me felt stuck. Around that time, I started noticing another pattern. Lauren rarely compared me directly to Derek. If she had, maybe I would have confronted it sooner. Instead, the comparisons arrived disguised as compliments. Derek was always so confident in difficult situations. Derek always knew how to make people laugh. Derek never worried too much about things. Derek had always been adventurous. Individually, those comments sounded harmless. Together, they created something much larger. One evening, we were driving home from a charity event downtown. Traffic moved slowly through the city while holiday lights reflected across the windshield. Lauren was talking about a problem at work when she casually mentioned how Derek would probably have handled the situation differently. A few minutes later, she laughed and said Derek always stayed calm under pressure. Then she added that Derek had a way of making everyone around him feel comfortable. She never said I lacked those qualities. She did not have to. The comparison was already there. I remember gripping the steering wheel and staring at the red brake lights ahead of us. Looking back, that conversation should have upset me. Instead, it left me strangely detached. Because for the first time, I was beginning to see the situation for what it really was. This was not about Derek being better than me. It was about Derek occupying a place in Lauren's mind that no husband should have to compete with. A few weeks later, we attended a neighborhood holiday gathering. The host transformed his home into something that looked like a scene from a movie. Christmas lights covered the trees. Music played softly through outdoor speakers. Families gathered around fire pits while children ran across snow-covered lawns. The atmosphere was warm despite the cold air. At one point, I found myself standing near the back patio, speaking with several neighbors. From across the yard, I could see Lauren talking with Derek. They were surrounded by friends, laughing about stories from years ago. Then something happened that stayed with me long after the evening ended. One of the guests jokingly asked how they always seemed to know exactly what the other person was thinking. Lauren laughed and replied that some connections never really disappear. The group smiled. Nobody thought anything of it. Nobody except me. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight I could not ignore. Some connections never really disappear. On the drive home, I replayed that sentence over and over in my head. The streets were quiet. Snow lined the sidewalks. Holiday decorations glowed from front porches throughout the neighborhood. Lauren seemed perfectly content. She talked about upcoming family plans and Christmas shopping while I listened in silence. What she did not know was that something had shifted again. I was no longer asking whether Derek was too involved in our lives. I was asking why Lauren seemed so determined to preserve that connection regardless of how it affected her marriage. Those are very different questions. One focuses on another person. The other focuses on the relationship itself. Looking back, that realization changed everything. Because once I stopped viewing Derek as the problem, I began paying closer attention to Lauren's choices. Her priorities. Her willingness to protect one relationship while dismissing concerns about another. The answer became impossible to ignore. For years, I had been participating in a competition I never agreed to enter. Worse, I was the only one competing. And the moment I understood that, I began wondering what my life might look like if I simply stopped playing altogether. Winter settled fully over Colorado by the time everything became impossible to ignore. Snow-covered rooftops across the neighborhood, and the mountains beyond Denver looked like they had been carved from ice. Most evenings, Lauren and I followed the same routine. Dinner, television, casual conversation. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. Yet beneath the surface, I felt as though I was watching my marriage through a window instead of living inside it. The turning point came in January during a large company celebration hosted by one of Lauren's colleagues. The event took place at a hotel ballroom downtown. The room was elegant, decorated with soft lighting, white tablecloths, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Hundreds of small lights reflected against the glass while snow drifted through the darkness outside. It should have been a pleasant evening. Looking back, it became the night I finally stopped lying to myself. Derek was there. Of course he was. By then, his presence felt as predictable as the sunrise. Throughout the evening, I watched the same familiar pattern unfold. Lauren seemed energized whenever he entered a conversation. She listened closely. She laughed quickly. She remembered details about stories he told months earlier. The difference was subtle enough that most people would never notice. But I noticed. I had been noticing for years. The only thing that changed was my willingness to acknowledge it. About halfway through the evening, a group gathered around one of the cocktail tables near the center of the ballroom. Someone brought up old friendships and how rare it was for people to remain close after relationships ended. The conversation naturally shifted toward Lauren and Derek. Several people commented on how impressive it was that they had maintained such a strong connection over the years. Then one of Lauren's co-workers smiled and said something that caused the entire group to laugh. He joked that Lauren and Derek seemed more like a married couple than some actual married couples he knew. The comment was meant to be harmless. Most people laughed politely and moved on. But what happened next stayed with me. Lauren laughed too. Not awkwardly. Not uncomfortably. She laughed harder than anyone else. Derek laughed beside her. The group continued joking while I stood there holding a glass of sparkling water, feeling as though I had suddenly become invisible. Nobody seemed to notice. Nobody seemed to think there was anything strange about it. I remember looking around the room at smiling faces illuminated by warm golden light. Music played softly in the background. Servers carried trays through the crowd. Everything appeared normal. Yet standing there, I felt something inside me quietly break. Not my heart. Something more important. The illusion. The illusion that everyone involved understood where healthy boundaries should exist. The illusion that my discomfort mattered. The illusion that if I explained myself clearly enough, things would eventually improve. Later that night, Lauren found me standing near one of the large windows overlooking the city. Snowflakes drifted beneath the streetlights far below. She asked whether I was enjoying myself. I looked at her for a moment before answering. The question felt almost surreal. She had witnessed the entire evening. She had participated in it. Yet she genuinely seemed confused by my distance. I told her I was fine. The answer came automatically. Years earlier, I might have explained everything I was feeling. I might have asked difficult questions. I might have tried once again to make her understand. Instead, I simply looked out at the city lights and let the conversation end. The drive home was nearly silent. Lauren scrolled through messages while I focused on the road ahead. Streetlights passed across the windshield one after another. Looking back, I think that was the exact moment my perspective changed. Until then, I had been trying to save the marriage. After that night, I started wondering whether the marriage had been asking too much from me for far too long. Because when the person beside you consistently fails to protect your place in their life, eventually you stop asking for protection. You start asking yourself a different question entirely. What would happen if you finally walked away from the competition and chose yourself instead? After that night, I stopped trying to win. The strange thing was that nobody noticed at first, especially Lauren. For years, our relationship had followed a predictable pattern. Something involving Derek would bother me. I would bring it up. Lauren would explain why I was overreacting. Eventually, the conversation would end with me apologizing for creating tension. It was a cycle so familiar that neither of us questioned it anymore. Then suddenly, it stopped. February arrived with freezing mornings and pale sunlight reflecting off patches of snow that still covered parts of the neighborhood. The mountains stood white against the horizon, and life continued moving forward one ordinary day at a time. Yet internally, something fundamental had changed. Lauren mentioned Derek. I nodded. She told stories involving Derek. I listened politely. She attended events where Derek would be present. I wished her a good time. At first, I think she viewed my silence as progress. Maybe she believed I had finally accepted the situation. The truth was very different. Acceptance and detachment can look similar from a distance. One afternoon, I left work early and drove west toward the foothills. The roads were quiet, and the air carried that crisp Colorado cold that somehow feels refreshing rather than unpleasant. I spent several hours hiking alone along a trail I used to visit years earlier. Surrounded by pine trees and distant mountain views, I realized something unexpected. I felt peaceful. Not happy exactly, but peaceful. The constant tension that had followed me for so long was beginning to fade. For the first time in years, my emotional well-being was no longer dependent on Lauren understanding my feelings. That realization felt liberating. Over the following weeks, I started reconnecting with parts of myself that had quietly disappeared. I spent more time with friends. I joined weekend activities I had neglected for years. I read more, exercised more, worked on professional goals I had postponed. None of it was done to prove anything. I was not trying to make Lauren jealous. I was not creating a strategy. I was simply rebuilding a life that felt increasingly disconnected from my marriage. Looking back, that was probably the moment everything truly began changing. One Saturday morning, Lauren asked whether I wanted to join her and several friends for brunch downtown. Derek would be there. A few months earlier, I would have spent hours debating whether to attend. This time I already had plans. I told her I was meeting an old friend instead. The surprise on her face lasted only a second. Then she smiled and said she understood. But later that evening, I noticed she seemed distracted, as though something about my answer had unsettled her. Another week passed, then another. The more I focused on my own life, the more aware Lauren seemed to become of the distance growing between us. One evening, she asked whether everything was all right. We were standing in the kitchen after dinner while the dishwasher hummed quietly in the background. Outside, snowflakes drifted beneath the glow of the porch light. I looked at her and considered how to answer. There were hundreds of things I could have said. Years of frustration, years of disappointment, years of feeling unheard. Instead, I simply told her I had been doing a lot of thinking lately. She nodded slowly but did not ask further questions. Looking back, I think she expected me to continue carrying the emotional weight of our relationship. She expected me to keep fighting for attention, keep defending my place, keep explaining why certain things hurt. What she did not realize was that I was running out of reasons to fight. Not because I stopped caring, because caring had become exhausting. Late one evening near the end of February, I sat alone in the living room while Lauren slept upstairs. The house was completely silent. Moonlight filtered through the windows, casting pale reflections across the hardwood floors. I stared into the darkness and realized something important. The pain was fading. The anger was fading. Even the disappointment was fading. In their place, something else had arrived. Clarity. And once clarity arrives, it becomes very difficult to keep pretending that everything is fine. March arrived with longer days and the first signs of spring appearing across Colorado. Snow still lingered in shaded corners of parking lots, but the air felt different. The season was changing, and so was I. Looking back, this was the point where I finally understood something that had taken me years to see. Derek was never the real problem. For a long time, I convinced myself that if he disappeared from our lives, everything would return to normal. I thought the tension, the distance, and the disappointment would fade away. But once I stepped back emotionally, the truth became impossible to ignore. The issue was not another man. The issue was that Lauren had never fully left the past behind. One evening, I came home earlier than expected after a meeting was canceled. The house was quiet. Sunlight filtered through the living room windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Lauren was sitting alone on the couch looking through old photographs on her tablet. She did not notice me at first. From where I stood, I could see images from years before we were married. College events, road trips, gatherings with old friends. Derek appeared in many of them. There was nothing inappropriate about the photographs. They were simply memories. Yet something about the way Lauren looked at them caught my attention. She was not just remembering moments. She seemed to be revisiting a version of herself that she missed. Later that night, I found myself thinking about all the years we had spent together. The decisions we made, the places we lived, the plans we built. And for the first time, I wondered how many of those years Lauren had spent looking backward instead of forward. A few days later, another moment reinforced that feeling. We attended a small gathering at a friend's house. During dinner, someone asked a simple question about the biggest influences in people's lives. The answers varied. Parents, mentors, teachers, friends. When it was Lauren's turn, she smiled thoughtfully and spoke about people who shaped who we become. She mentioned several names. One of them was Derek. Again, there was nothing wrong with that. Yet what stayed with me was the way she described him. Not as someone from her past, not as a chapter that had ended, but as a continuing presence in her life story. Driving home that night, I finally stopped feeling hurt. Instead, I felt clarity. Lauren was not choosing Derek over me in a direct sense. The reality was more complicated. Part of her identity remained connected to a period of life that existed before our marriage. Derek represented that period. He represented unfinished nostalgia, familiarity, comfort, history. And because of that, she protected the connection no matter how many concerns it created. Looking back, that realization was strangely freeing. It removed the competition from the equation. I was never competing against another man. I was competing against an idealized version of the past. No husband can win that battle because memories never have bad days. Memories never disappoint anyone. Memories only become more polished with time. One Saturday morning, I sat on the back patio drinking coffee while the sun rose above the neighborhood. Birds moved between budding trees. The air carried the fresh scent of spring. For the first time in months, I felt completely calm. I understood something that had once terrified me. The marriage could not be repaired by changing Derek's role in our lives. It could only be repaired if Lauren recognized the distance that had grown between us and chose to address it herself. And deep down, I was no longer sure she even saw that distance. That realization should have broken my heart. Instead, it brought a sense of peace. Because once you finally understand the real problem, you stop wasting energy fighting the wrong one. And from that moment forward, my focus shifted entirely. Not toward saving the life I had, toward building the life I deserved. April arrived with clear skies, warmer afternoons, and the kind of sunlight that makes Colorado feel completely different after a long winter. The trees throughout our neighborhood were beginning to turn green again. People spent more time outside. Restaurants reopened their patios. Life seemed to be waking up. In many ways, so was I. The biggest difference was that I had stopped measuring my happiness through the condition of my marriage. For years, I had tied almost every part of my emotional well-being to whether Lauren and I were doing well. If we had a good week, I felt good. If we had tension, I carried it everywhere. Without realizing it, I had allowed one relationship to become the center of my entire life. Now that was changing. One Saturday morning, I accepted an invitation from an old college friend I had not seen regularly in years. He owned a small cabin near the foothills west of Boulder and needed help with a renovation project. We spent the day replacing sections of an aging deck, drinking coffee, and talking about everything from careers to family life. As the hours passed, I found myself laughing more than I had in a long time. Not because anything extraordinary happened, because I was present, fully present. There was no emotional weight hanging over every conversation, no silent frustration following me from room to room. Driving home that evening beneath a sky painted orange and gold by the setting sun, I realized how much of myself I had neglected. During the following weeks, I continued building new routines. I started hiking regularly again. I attended professional networking events that I would have ignored in the past. I accepted invitations instead of automatically declining them. Opportunities began appearing where I had once seen only obligations. One afternoon, an old colleague called about a leadership position opening in another division of our company. The role would involve more responsibility and significantly better compensation. Months earlier, I would have immediately dismissed the possibility because of how it might affect our household routine. This time, I listened carefully, not because I was certain I wanted the position, because for the first time, I was allowing myself to imagine a future based on my own goals. Lauren noticed the changes. At first, she said very little. Then the questions started. She asked where I had been spending my weekends. She asked why I seemed busier than usual. She asked why I was suddenly reconnecting with so many friends. None of the questions sounded accusatory. If anything, they sounded confused. Looking back, I think she had become accustomed to a version of me that always revolved around the marriage. Seeing me build a life beyond it felt unfamiliar. One evening, she suggested that we take a weekend trip together. The proposal surprised me because it had been years since she initiated something like that. I thanked her and told her I already had plans to spend the weekend hiking with friends. For a brief moment, disappointment crossed her face. Then it disappeared. The conversation moved on. Yet something about that moment stayed with me. Not because I felt guilty, because I realized how much had changed. A year earlier, I would have canceled everything to prioritize the opportunity. Now I simply honored the commitment I had already made. Another evening, Lauren invited me to dinner at a new restaurant that had recently opened downtown. Once again, I already had plans. Once again, she seemed surprised. The pattern repeated itself throughout the month. The more I invested in my own life, the more aware Lauren seemed to become of the distance between us. The irony was impossible to ignore. For years, I had tried to explain that distance. For years, she dismissed my concerns. Now she was finally noticing it on her own. Late one afternoon near the end of April, I sat alone on our back patio watching sunlight fade behind the Rocky Mountains. The air was cool and quiet. Birds moved between the trees while children played somewhere farther down the street. I stared at the horizon and thought about the previous year, about all the conversations, all the disappointments, all the energy I spent trying to hold together something that increasingly felt one-sided. And for the first time, I understood something clearly. I was no longer preparing to save my marriage. I was preparing to survive without it. The difference between those two mindsets is enormous. One is driven by hope. The other is driven by acceptance. And once acceptance arrives, the future stops feeling frightening. It starts feeling possible. May arrived with bright mornings, green hillsides, and the kind of clear Colorado skies that seem endless. By then, the decision I had spent months avoiding was no longer a question. It had become a reality waiting to be acknowledged. The strange thing was that nothing dramatic pushed me there. No major argument. No shocking confession. No single event. The truth was much simpler. A marriage can survive mistakes. It can survive misunderstandings. It can even survive difficult seasons. What it cannot survive indefinitely is years of emotional neglect. One Tuesday afternoon, I left work early and drove downtown to meet with an attorney. The office occupied the upper floor of a modern building overlooking the city. Through the windows, I could see traffic moving through busy intersections while pedestrians crossed beneath the afternoon sun. The meeting itself was calm and professional. We discussed options, timelines, and practical considerations. There was no bitterness in the conversation. No anger. Just facts. Looking back, I remember feeling surprisingly peaceful when I walked back to my truck. For so long, the future had felt uncertain. Now it felt clear. During the weeks that followed, I continued living normally. I went to work, attended social events, spent time outdoors. The only difference was that my perspective had changed. Instead of trying to preserve a future that no longer felt sustainable, I was quietly preparing for a different one. Lauren sensed it. I could see it in the way she watched me, in the questions she asked, in the conversations she suddenly wanted to have. One evening she suggested that we spend more time together. Another evening she invited me to dinner. A week later she proposed a weekend trip. None of those suggestions were unreasonable. In fact, part of me wished they had happened years earlier. The problem was not the effort itself. The problem was timing. Effort matters most when it arrives before the damage becomes permanent. Around that same time, I noticed something else. Derek's presence seemed to be shrinking. His name appeared less frequently in conversations. The stories became less common. The constant references that had once dominated so much of our life began fading into the background. Looking back, I think Lauren was finally becoming aware of the connection between her choices and the distance growing between us. The irony was impossible to ignore. For years, I had tried to explain that distance. Now she was discovering it on her own. One Saturday afternoon, I returned home from a hike near Estes Park. The mountains were beautiful that day. Snow remained on the highest peaks, while wildflowers covered parts of the lower valleys. The drive had given me plenty of time to think. When I walked through the front door, I found Lauren sitting alone in the living room. The television was off. The house was unusually quiet. She looked up as I entered and asked if we could talk. Something in her voice immediately told me this conversation would be different. We sat across from each other while sunlight streamed through the windows. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Lauren finally asked the question that had been waiting between us for months. "Are you leaving?" The room felt completely silent afterward. I remember hearing the distant hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and faint sounds of children playing somewhere outside. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Then I told her the truth. I explained that I felt emotionally alone for years. I explained that every attempt to discuss my concerns had been minimized or dismissed. I explained that eventually I stopped feeling like a husband and started feeling like an observer in my own marriage. My voice remained calm. So did hers. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. The conversation felt more like two people finally acknowledging something they had both known for a long time. Tears appeared in Lauren's eyes as she listened. For the first time, I could see genuine understanding beginning to replace confusion. Not complete understanding, but enough. Enough to recognize that the distance between us had not appeared overnight. It had grown slowly through hundreds of small choices spread across many years. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the room, I realized something important. The hardest part was no longer making the decision. The hardest part had been accepting it. And now that acceptance had finally arrived, there was nothing left to avoid. 3 months later, summer had arrived in Colorado. The snow had disappeared from the foothills. The trees were full and green. The long evenings stretched across the horizon beneath clear blue skies. By then, my life looked very different from the one I had spent years trying to protect. The legal process had moved forward peacefully. We divided what needed to be divided, signed what needed to be signed, and handled everything with the kind of maturity that only seems possible after people finally stop fighting reality. I moved into a smaller home on the western side of Denver. It was not extravagant, but it was mine. Large windows overlooked the foothills, and every evening the setting sun painted the mountains gold. For the first time in years, my home felt calm. There were no unspoken tensions, no silent disappointments waiting around every corner. Just peace. Looking back, peace was all I had wanted from the beginning. Then one Saturday morning in late August, the moment I mentioned at the beginning of this story finally arrived. I had just finished making coffee when someone knocked on my front door. The sound echoed through the quiet house. I remember setting down my mug and walking across the hardwood floor toward the entrance. When I opened the door, Lauren was standing there. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. The morning sunlight illuminated the front porch while a light breeze moved through the trees lining the street. She looked nervous, more nervous than I had ever seen her. Not because of anger, because of uncertainty. The confidence that had once defined her seemed replaced by hesitation. I invited her inside. We sat across from each other in the living room while sunlight streamed through the windows. For several moments, neither of us knew where to begin. Eventually, Lauren spoke first. She admitted that she had spent the previous months reflecting on everything that happened. She said she finally understood how many concerns I had tried to express over the years. She admitted that she dismissed things she should have taken seriously. She admitted that she assumed I would always stay, no matter how distant the marriage became. Then she looked at me and said something I never expected to hear. She said she wished she had listened sooner. The room felt very quiet afterward. I listened without interrupting, without judging, without trying to prove a point, because by then, I no longer needed validation. I no longer needed an apology to move forward. Lauren explained that she had gradually reduced contact with Derek after realizing how much of her emotional energy had remained attached to the past. She said she had spent years protecting a connection because it felt familiar, without recognizing what it was costing her marriage. She told me she regretted that deeply. Then she asked whether there was any chance we could start over. Looking back, that was the question I once dreamed of hearing. For years, I wanted Lauren to understand what I was feeling. For years, I wanted her to recognize the damage being done. Yet sitting there that morning, I felt something surprising. Gratitude. Not because she wanted another chance. Because her words confirmed that I had not imagined any of it. The distance had been real. The pain had been real. The loneliness had been real. I thanked her for her honesty. Then I told her the truth. I said I genuinely hoped she found happiness. I said I had forgiven her long ago. But I also explained that forgiveness and rebuilding are not always the same thing. Some things can be repaired. Others can only be learned from. Tears filled her eyes. Mine remained dry. Not because I cared less. Because I had already completed the grieving process months earlier. We talked for another half hour before standing to say goodbye. When she walked toward the front door, neither of us seemed angry. Neither of us seemed bitter. We were simply two people standing at the end of a chapter that should have ended long before it finally did. After she left, I stood on the porch watching her car disappear down the street. The mountains stretched across the horizon beneath a bright Colorado sky. For a long time, I simply stood there appreciating the silence. Then I went back inside and continued with my day. That was the moment I knew I was truly free. Not free because I had escaped something. Free because I had finally chosen myself. And if there is one lesson this experience taught me, it is that love cannot survive where respect consistently disappears. What do you think? Could this marriage have been saved if the warning signs had been taken seriously earlier, or was the outcome inevitable long before either of us realized it? Share your thoughts because every perspective tells a different story. And if stories about resilience, self-respect, difficult choices, and personal growth resonate with you, consider subscribing so you do not miss future journeys like this one. Sometimes the most important lessons come from watching ordinary people discover their own worth.